Ragnar Lothbrok. The most famous Viking who ever lived might not have existed. Not as one person, anyway. Historians who study the sagas keep running into the same problem. Ragnar's story doesn't hold together as one man's biography. Different timelines, different wives, different sons showing up in different centuries. Events that look more like several lifetimes squeezed into one. A real person can't do that. A composite legend, stitched together from multiple warlords over a few hundred years of retelling, can a possibly fake man still mattered? Because the fake version won anyway. Ragnar's sons, real or not, became the engine of an actual historical event. The Great Heathen Army that tore through England in 865 was led by men who called themselves his sons, Ivar, Bjorn, Halfdan. Nobody can confirm Ragnar actually died in a snake pit cursing the king who killed him, but that revenge story gave an entire invasion force its emotional fuel. There's something almost uncomfortably modern in that. You don't need a real martyr to start a real war. You need enough men who believe one existed. It also explains why so many later Scandinavian kings tried to claim descent from him. Being descended from a real warlord gets you a respectable lineage. Being descended from Ragnar gets you a legend's bloodline, and legends are far more useful for justifying a claim to a throne than any actual paper trail could be. Ragnar never won a single battle anyone can point to. He just had to be worth avenging. Ivar the Boneless. There was a Viking commander so feared that English chroniclers didn't call him by a normal name. They called him something closer to a description of a condition, and nobody at the time wrote down exactly what that condition was. Some accounts say he couldn't walk on his own, carried into battle on a shield, raised above the chaos like a banner. Other versions point somewhere uglier, a private joke that turned into a public insult, slang for something he supposedly couldn't manage in the bedroom. Historians still argue over which version is closer to true, and there's no settling it from here. Ivar is tied directly to the Great Heathen Army, the same invasion force behind Ragnar's legendary revenge. This wasn't a smash-and-grab raid. It was an occupying force that stayed in England for years and broke 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms apart. Some sources link Ivar to a commander the English chroniclers called Hingwar, possibly the same man recorded under a different name. What actually held an army like that together for years, far from home, in hostile territory, says something about the man leading it. Raiding for a season requires nerve. Running a multi-year occupation requires logistics, supply lines, and the loyalty of men who could have just as easily killed their commander and gone home. Whatever was happening with Ivar's body, it clearly wasn't slowing down the part of him that mattered to his men. A nickname that might have been an insult. A man who may have needed help standing upright. That same man helped dismantle kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Fear, in his case, clearly didn't require strength. It required being unstoppable on whatever terms his body allowed. Rollo of Normandy. For years, Rollo was exactly the kind of problem French nobles lost sleep over. Raids along the Seine, repeated and relentless, the kind of violence that made river towns nervous every time the tide came in. Eventually, King Charles III of France looked at the cost of an unwinnable war and made a decision that probably felt insane to his own court. Instead of continuing to fight Rollo, he handed him land. Real land, official territory, the region that would become Normandy. In exchange, Rollo had to convert to Christianity and become Charles's vassal, meaning he now technically worked for the king he used to terrorize. The French crown got the smartest deal of the century out of it, a former raider standing guard against the raiders still coming. It's worth pointing out how unusual that arrangement was for the time. Most medieval rulers dealt with a persistent enemy by trying harder to crush them, pouring more resources into a fight that often just produced more dead soldiers and the same unsolved problem the following year. Charles tried something closer to a hiring decision, and it worked far better than another decade of burned villages would have. His descendants didn't settle quietly into Norman life either. One of them crossed the English Channel in 1066 and took the English throne by force, so the bloodline of a man who once terrorized French river towns eventually produced a king of England. What Rollo kept after he settled down wasn't the violence. It was the instinct underneath it, the part that knew exactly when to stop taking and start negotiating. Harald Bluetooth. Harald ruled Denmark and claimed control over Norway. And rather than just telling people about it, he carved his accomplishments into a giant stone and put it somewhere everyone passing through would see it. The gelling stone, raised around 965, reads almost like an ancient press release. It claims Harald won all of Denmark and Norway. It claims he made the Danes Christian. One face shows an animal wrapped in serpents, the old pagan world. The other shows Christ. It's a before and after photo of a kingdom's identity, carved by the man who decided the after. Nobody can say for certain whether the conversion was genuinely spiritual underneath all the politics. It was also extremely convenient. Christian kings across Europe found it harder to treat a fellow Christian ruler as a savage to be conquered, so Harald's baptism worked as a diplomatic shield as much as a religious choice. There's a story tied to the stone, too, that it was raised partly as a memorial to his parents, and partly as a permanent record meant to outlast any rival's ability to rewrite history after Harald was gone. Stone doesn't burn the way wooden halls do, and it doesn't get reworded by the next king's poets. If you wanted a claim that survived you by centuries, granite was a smarter investment than gold. You already know Harald Bluetooth, even if the name sounds unfamiliar. The wireless technology connecting your phone to your headphones is named after him, because the engineers behind it wanted something representing unification, the same idea behind his attempt to bring Denmark and Norway under one banner. 1,000 years after he carved his accomplishments into rock, his name is still connecting things, just not the things he expected. Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn conquered England in 1013. The end point of years of raids, tribute payments, and steady English political collapse. It wasn't one dramatic battle. It was a slow, systematic takeover, where local nobles eventually handed over hostages and submission because resistance had stopped being worth it months earlier. He became king. The thing he'd spent decades building toward, the goal that swallowed his entire adult life. The conquest itself had taken a particular kind of patience most invaders never bother with. Sweyn had tried England before, and failed. Rather than throw another army at the problem immediately, he waited, rebuilt, and returned years later when English resistance had worn itself down through a long string of earlier raids. He didn't even need to personally lead. He held it for a matter of weeks before his body gave out. Decades of effort collapsing into a footnote. His son inherited what should have been Sweyn's legacy to actually rule. And that son, Cnut, is remembered today as one of history's great kings. Sweyn is remembered as the man who did all the hard work and barely got the receipt. There's a version of European history where Sweyn lives another 20 years and reshapes England under his own name. We'll never know what that one looks like. Cnut the Great. Most people who've heard of Cnut know one story about him, and it's usually told backwards. The popular version says he was an arrogant king who genuinely believed he could command the ocean to stop. He sat his throne by the shore, ordered the tide to halt, and looked foolish when the water kept coming anyway. The actual point was the opposite. Cnut staged the whole thing on purpose, so his flattering courtiers would watch their king fail against nature. Proof that even the most powerful man alive answers to something bigger than himself. Most retellings get the punchline exactly backwards. There's a deeper story underneath that one. Cnut inherited his father Sweyn's unfinished English conquest, fought a war against Edmund Ironside to actually secure it, and built what historians call the North Sea Empire, England, Denmark, and Norway all answering to one ruler, held together by ships and royal marriages instead of roads. Running an empire like that meant spending an unusual amount of time simply traveling between the pieces of it. Since no single court could govern 3 kingdoms separated by open water without the king himself showing up often enough to remind everyone who was actually in charge. Cnut spent years doing exactly that, splitting his attention between England and Scandinavia in a way few rulers of the period attempted. In 1027, he traveled all the way to Rome and wrote a letter home about the trip, framing it as devotion to the kingdoms entrusted to him. A Viking-blooded king, presenting himself to Christian Europe as a legitimate monarch rather than a raider with a crown. The empire never outlived him. Cnut held the whole thing together personally, and once he was gone, there was nothing left at the center to hold on to. It came apart within a single generation. Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf Tryggvason gets remembered as the king who Christianized Norway, which makes him sound like a missionary. The more accurate description is a man who realized conversion could function exactly like conquest, just without burning every village down to get there. Local chieftains across Norway built their power on old religious networks, sacred sites, traditional rituals, generations of inherited respect. Olaf understood that replacing the gods meant replacing the structure underneath them, often without fighting a single battle for that territory. Public conversions, royal pressure, and the occasional brutal punishment for refusal did the rest. Some accounts describe Olaf personally overseeing the destruction of pagan temples and forcing local leaders to choose between baptism and exile. A level of direct involvement that suggests he understood exactly how much of his authority ran through religion rather than around it. He wasn't delegating the hard part to bishops. He was doing it himself, region by region. His reign lasted only about 5 years, and somehow the transformation he pushed through reshaped Norway's future far beyond what 5 years should have been able to accomplish. His ending fits almost too neatly. Olaf died at the Battle of Svolder, betrayed by rival forces, vanishing into the sea in a scene that reads more like staged myth than recorded history. Erik Bloodaxe. His nickname alone sounds like something off a war banner. Bloodaxe. The kind of name that should belong to the most secure, most feared ruler of his era. His actual political career was a mess of instability, family betrayal, and repeated failure to hold on to power. Erik tried to centralize control over Norway around 930, partly by eliminating rival brothers who stood in his way. Killing family members to secure a throne wasn't exactly rare for the period, but the backlash against Erik specifically ran deep enough to push him out of Norway entirely. The brutality meant to secure his rule ended up costing him the throne instead. What makes his case stand out from the usual fratricide and survive pattern common among Viking kings is just how publicly the backlash played out. Other rulers managed similar bloodshed and kept their crowns for decades. Erik's reputation seems to have worked against him almost immediately, suggesting the killings themselves weren't the problem so much as how little support he'd built up beforehand to survive the fallout. A deposed Viking king doesn't necessarily stay deposed, though. Erik resurfaces in Northumbria, in northern England, as king there instead, which says something about how fluid Viking power actually was in this period. Losing a crown in Scandinavia didn't mean losing access to power. It meant relocating. An entire era of independent Viking-style kingship in that region effectively closes with his eventual fall in Northumbria. Aud the Deep-Minded. Aud, sometimes called Un, didn't lead an army. She led a household, a family network, and an extended migration across an entire ocean region during one of the most dangerous periods imaginable for a woman without male protection. After losing the men who would normally have secured her status and safety, history's usual move is to erase a woman in that position. Aud avoided it by staying in motion. She moved her people, her property, and her family's reputation to Scotland, then Orkney, then eventually Iceland, scouting territory and securing land claims along the way. Think about what that actually required. Negotiating passage, managing wealth across multiple relocations, arranging marriages for the people under her protection, establishing legitimate land claims in a brand new settlement where reputation mattered as much as any sword. The Iceland she was settling into wasn't an empty island waiting for arrivals either. Land claims had to be staked, defended, and recognized by other settlers who had every incentive to dispute a newcomer's boundaries. Especially a newcomer without a husband or sons old enough to back up a claim by force if it came to that. Aud secured her territory through reputation and careful alliance building instead, and it held. None of it involved a weapon. It involved ships, inheritance, and the administrative will to rebuild a household standing from nothing after catastrophe. Her title, The Deep-Minded, wasn't a battlefield nickname. It described a kind of intelligence most retellings of this era don't have a category for.
Harald Hardrada.
Before Harald Hardrada became king of Norway, he was exiled, broke, and far from home. So he did something that sounds almost unbelievable for a future Viking king. He traveled to Kievan Rus, made his way to Constantinople, and joined the Varangian Guard, the elite foreign mercenary force protecting Byzantine emperors. This wasn't raiding a coastal monastery for silver. This was fighting across Byzantine frontiers in the Mediterranean and Anatolia, inside one of the most sophisticated military and political systems on Earth at the time. Harald watched imperial court politics up close, the kind of statecraft no Viking homeland could have taught him. He rose to command within the Guard itself, fighting in campaigns across Sicily and the Holy Land, accumulating wealth through his share of imperial campaigns the way other Vikings accumulated it through raiding. By the time politics in Constantinople turned against him and he finally headed home, he'd spent close to 2 decades abroad, longer than most Viking leaders spent doing anything in one place at all. He came home rich and experienced, carrying a nickname that translates to something like Hard Ruler. The name fit the severity and ambition he brought back with him. His ending is the one every Viking documentary eventually has to reach. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, Harald Hardrada led one final great Viking invasion into England and died there, just weeks before the Norman conquest reshaped the country permanently. Historians often mark his death as the symbolic close of the entire Viking Age, the old world charging in one last time before something else took over for good.